Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast, Episode 10, Bury Your Queens, Part 1. 10 episodes, something like 20 hours of total content when bonus episodes and Patreon content is included. Crazy. Thanks for all your support, everyone. Apologies that I'm recording this while I've got some sort of respiratory illness going on. We'll just power through. So this is my first full episode without any scholar to bring me through it. It's just you and me locked in here. Scholars will return, but of course, if you're starved for folks with PhDs sharing their expertise or you grow tired of hearing just my voice, you can support the show and check out all of my full-length interviews with scholars at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast. In Episode 9, I discussed early Hebrew and West Semitic writing, noting how the Israelite king Jeroboam, and especially his Judahite counterpart Rehoboam, do not seem to have much real history in their biblical narratives, if Rehoboam even existed at all. And that's true for the biblical description of the period that spans this episode as well. But at the very least, as we're entering the period where writing is re-emerging, we will have a handful of our first real, confirmed, historical people from the Bible who have extra-biblical, archaeological attestation. We're getting there, folks. Real people, real history. Along the way, we'll also explore the return of empires and the unjust shunning of three women, Queen Mother Maacah, the goddess Ashera, and Queen Jezebel. For today's main sources, in addition to the standard history text from the last few episodes, I'm also relying on Emanuel Pfoh's The Emergence of Israel in Iron Age Palestine and past Bible lore guest Susan Ackerman's Warrior, Dancer, Seductress, Queen. These and all other sources are listed in the bibliography portion of the episode description, as always. The history of Judah and Israel, the history of the Bible, is somewhat distinct as ancient histories go. It's one of imperial subjugation and regional hegemony, but from the point of view of the smaller kingdoms, not the region's great powers. Most of the time, when we read history, it's the great empires doing the conquering and hegemonizing and warring amongst themselves. Rome, Alexander the Great and his successors, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and so on and so on. Partly it's because they're the ones who, wrote the history down. Writing was an expensive technology, one that takes labor, which isn't focused on making things people will eat or wear or use for survival. As we've established, writing arose once these societies became complex enough to need it. So it shouldn't surprise us that we get a lot more perspectives from the wealthier cultures who needed this technology, but who usually were the ones doing the oppressing and subjugating, even if sometimes these same kingdoms were themselves under the thumb of even larger kingdoms. Today, after a few episodes of, we don't really know what happened in this period wheel spinning, and a reliance on discussing the problematic biblical accounts of the early Iron Age, we're finally back, for better and worse, to seeing empires emerge and assert themselves over our beloved little land of ancient West Asia. Better in that we do have contemporary accounts again, worse in that those same contemporary accounts describe, once again, the conquest and subjugation of the Levant. Sometime in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, whose shadow we will eventually get out from under, I swear, another piece of critical technology made its way westward from Mesopotamia into the Mediterranean area. A technology whose ability to allow travel through the desert would significantly bolster trade and exchange. I am, of course, talking about the camel. While camels had been around as an extant species for a long while, possibly with some kind of domestication in Mesopotamia especially that predates this period, there's a significant increase in camel bones in the archaeological record around the Iron Age period that shows a species on the rise, and it shows their spread from Iraq into Egypt. For a long time, scholars have noted that their depiction in biblical stories like those of the patriarchs, which are set before the Iron Age, make them almost certainly anachronistic, a reflection of later Iron Age societal conditions from the time when these stories were actually retold and written down, and the camel by then was king of trade. It was hard to even imagine a time before the camel. Because once our four-legged, hairy semi-truck friends made their way onto the scene, it meant that one could potentially cut through many parts of the Fertile Crescent, especially the northern reaches of the Arabian Desert, radically reshaping trade routes. One such artery passed through the southern parts of the Levant, and for the Egyptian pharaoh Shishak.
Only guilty man in Shawshank.
That meant the trading stops of Edom in modern-day Jordan lay past the Negev, the southern desert reaches of what will become the Kingdom of Judah. And now that Egypt was regaining its footing, Shishak decided it was time to regain control of these eastern Mediterranean lands and trade routes that had been under his predecessor's thumbs until the collapse some 250 years prior. Shishak seems to be our first historical character for whom we have real, extra-biblical evidence. In the Bible, he's called Shishak, and not only was he a real guy, a real pharaoh, but his campaign into the small chieftainships of Judah and Israel, among most of the rest of the Levant, are some of the first generally confirmed events in our biblical narrative, though the details as described in the Bible can't be relied on. The part where he was the pharaoh who sheltered Jeroboam after his flight into Egypt? Probably not. But memories of this prolonged assault, whichever decade it took place in during the mid to late 10th century BCE, were of a devastation that was traumatic enough to serve as the inspiration for, perhaps, the unnamed pharaoh of the Moses narrative. It's possible that this onslaught is behind the hatred of Egypt that overshadows our Exodus tale. So while once again the biblical narratives are pretty suspect and likely incorrect in their chronology and specifics, Shishak did indeed boast of his campaign, inscribing tales of his victories on a wall in a temple we've visited a few times so far. That's right, we're finally back to the Carnac temple complex in Thebes, modern-day Luxor, Egypt, the site of so much of the history and historical writings from our previous episodes. Hatshepsut, our female pharaoh, restored Carnac after the Hyksos disaster in the middle of the second millennium. Akhenaten abandoned it and starved the temple of funding during his brief heretical reign. Ramses II expanded it as part of his glorious reign, and on Karnac's walls, Ramses' son Merneptah mentioned a people called Israel for the first time around 250 years before our current moment. And now we've arrived at Pharaoh Shishak's campaign, sometime around 925 or a few decades prior, an opening salvo to this period of reassertion of power. This inscription detailing the incursion features over 150 town names that were allegedly plowed through by the Egyptians. There may have been some battles, a lot of it seems to have just been purely extractive. Jerusalem, however, being out of the way and probably insignificant, is not even mentioned. This is a telltale sign that whatever the Judahite monarchy constituted, if it existed at this point, it was apparently an extremely limited city-state and not much else, not even worth being raided. Northern towns like Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer get mentioned, but there's no way to know how associated they were with each other. In other words, there's no real indication that even the north was united. We're still decades away from descriptions of a kingdom of Shechem or Samaria, but hey, the Israelite chiefdom has towns. They're towns in the Bible. That's something. In fact, anthropologist Emanuel Pfoh encourages us to think of these more as towns instead of cities, where instead of kings and lords, we'd be better off thinking of chiefs and village heads and elders. These groups don't have the kind of institutional and bureaucratic structure and complexity that an established monarchy might indicate, and referencing kings might give us the wrong idea. But if, as Kip Davis discussed in her interview in a previous episode, folks had abandoned city living for rural living and pastoral shepherding and subsistence farming in the Bronze Age collapse, Pfoh notes that this reassertion of power by the Egyptians and others led to a re-urbanization. People moved back into the city environments to defend themselves from the terror of militaries from Egypt, Assyria, and Aram, swarming over the land, extracting all of their wealth in whatever form it took. Food, precious metals, shrine goods, even their very gods. All was picked over by the imperial locust cloud. Shishak is instructive here, as it's in the wake of this campaign, the century that followed, where we see the Judahite and Israelite monarchies becoming, well, real actual monarchies. The smaller, mainly rural cultures that saw germination and growth in the vacuum of imperial hegemony following the Bronze Age collapse calcified and concentrated in these kingdoms that rose in response to the filling of that regional power void. Their very existence was a reaction to imperial aggression. It's possible and even likely that the small towns of what would become Israel had confederated before, perhaps temporarily. But whatever connection that they had as city-states or tribes didn't result in larger towns, scribal culture, a lasting monarchy, the kind of unique societal footprint that we associate with monarchies and kingdoms that hold power beyond their immediate hinterlands. It's still a two-horse town. That is, until around our present moment. So around the area, we've got Israel, along other city-states and small kingdoms such as Moab, Ammon, Phoenicia, Edom, and notably the Philistine Pentapolis, a collection of 5 city-states on the Palestinian coast. Most of these would be recalled as enemies of Israel. In fact, the northern parts of Israel, what will be called the Galilee, the tribes of Asher and Naphtali, don't seem to have been part of whatever confederation or early monarchy was present. It's possible there were other small city-states and confederations whose names have been lost to history. If there was a capital of whatever the Northern Confederation looked like, it probably would have been centered in Shechem, the site where in episode 9, Jacob set up a shrine called El Elohe Yisrael, or possibly the nearby Tirzah, a few miles northeast of Shechem. Based on archaeology, neither Tirzah nor Shechem, however, seem to have had a significant enough palace structure or material culture to have ruled over a broad and united kingdom, even if we limit it to just the north. Judah is there too, but they seem to have been especially small and again, probably not terribly united, as we've discussed in our previous episodes. People would have fled to the cities for protection, and fortifications and military capabilities were built up to repel and safeguard against incursions from Shishak and his counterparts in Assyria in the east and Aram in the north. Something curious about these newer political groupings is that they seem to have placed more significance on what we might call tribal structures than their Bronze Age predecessors, and we can see some of that in the biblical texts. The interconnectedness of all of the tribes, both real and fictional, who form this legendary construct of quote-unquote Israel, take pride of place over what some of the other imperial structures would value. The kings of Assyria and Babylon attach themselves to a single unbroken chain of kings stretching back into deep antiquity, and while there's definitely a fair bit of that in the Bible, it's also placed within a new context of being part of tribal subgroups that emerge within that lineage. What we have to be careful to recognize is that even for the larger kingdom or chiefdom of Israel, we're not sure where the borders and boundaries are. Just like we know there's no unbroken chain of kings from the Assyrian kings lists, and that the picture was far more complex and power was often projected that may not have existed in reality, this idea of tribal unity around one king out of Shechem or Tirzah was probably also not the case, let alone a similar story out of the tiny town of Jerusalem. Probably there was some real chief called David, and perhaps one called Jeroboam, who grew into being significant founding figures of legend. Both kingdoms, whatever they amounted to, seem to have started coalescing in these periods, but that's the best we can do. So the defensive buildups by these smaller kingdoms are then used by the imperial powers to justify their invasions as being preemptive strikes against hostile forces. You're torn between, look, they're barbarians who don't even live in cities, we must rule over these primitive types. Or on the other hand, if you do try to fight back, you're met with, see, I told you they had weapons of mass destruction. When we started invading, they fought back and built up defenses. They're thinking of attacking us, just like I said. It goes to show you're always going to be in a tough spot as a smaller polity, relying on shrewd diplomatic efforts and calculated responses if you don't have the men and material to really push back on the encroaching empires. Most likely, the imperial structures will function in a heads-I-win, tails-you-lose theory of power. And writings from the Assyrians and other imperial cultures of the time belie this, talking continuously about how much of a pain in the ass tribal culture around them was. These folks had enjoyed centuries of relative autonomy, and now some new upstarts were rebuilding the ancient cities, inserting themselves into the Assyrian kings lists, and making bold claims about what land actually belonged to the crown. This made for an interesting dynamic where many kings from even larger political entities like Aram could not secure corvée labor or military conscription from their supposed subjects in the same way that Hammurabi and others in the late Bronze Age were able to muster. Their agreements with tribes they ruled over amounted to some taxation and peace treaties and not much else, with both sides viewing each other with suspicion. These were often more commercial treaties than enslavement and oppression in such an explicit way. And that suspicion they had often boiled over into war between the kingdoms and rural tribes, creating the kind of tension that we see in the Hebrew Bible, where prophets and kings express dismay and hatred toward larger political entities like Babylon, Assyria, Aram, and the Philistines, but also often directed toward rural tribes who wouldn't submit to rule. Regional conflict, in other words, was back on the menu.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
Egypt, however, had a tough road to getting past the Sinai Peninsula as things went on. Sure, camels had made trade easier, but the militaries of the day began to use iron, which gave the age its name. So powerful was this metallurgic technology to the era that Yahweh himself seems to be unable to overcome it. In the first chapter of the book of Judges, there are a fair few curiosities. The conqueror Joshua is said to already have died at the end of the previous book, which bears his name, even though his death is recounted once again in the next chapter. The Israelites begin their final sweep of the Promised Land. They're even said to have taken 3 of the 5 cities of the Philistine Pentapolis, despite the book later indicating that Gaza, one of the cities they supposedly took, is still independent. Yes, that's the same Gaza that we have today. And of course, David is said to have to take all of Philistia, including these previously ruled towns. But there's something else that's odd in the first chapter, which comes in verse 19. Quote, "And Yahweh was with Judah, so that they took possession of the hill country, but they were not able to dispossess the inhabitants of the plain, for they had iron chariots." That's right, even with Yahweh's support, the Israelites are no match for iron chariots. And hey, that's fair. Yahweh's the patron god of a minor, perhaps barely existent kingdom at this point. Cut him some slack. Iron needs to reach extremely high temperatures, around 900 Fahrenheit or 500 Celsius, in order to be worked effectively. While this was achievable for jewelry and other small trinkets in the Bronze Age, in order to scale up production to equip an army, you need a hell of a lot of trees which could be turned into charcoal and then burned at high temperatures for efficient ironworking in furnaces. When the trade networks were functioning before the collapse, it was much easier to ship tin and copper from disparate locations all across West Asia and the Mediterranean. Not so once these things fell apart. But iron was a better metal anyway, and so once production techniques spread, there was no turning back. But not everyone benefited equally from this innovation. Egypt is not particularly known for its forests, and the advantage that the rest of West Asia had over them in this department meant that they had to keep their near monopoly on gold dedicated in trade for yet another critical commodity, wood imports. This means that, like Yahweh, their ability to compete was limited by iron. And Shawshank's incursion, while perhaps formative to later Israelite hatred of Egypt, was the exception and not the rule. They just didn't have enough lumber, and Egypt would never recover the heights of their Bronze Age empires. But for now, the Levant is under Egypt. This time, however, they don't have outposts in Gaza or further north that they're using to rule over the Levant. They're ruling from Egypt, which means that there was a lot less direct influence over the area. There are still things like an Egyptian-style scarab belonging to Shawshank's court that have been found, so we know they did exercise control over Israel and Judah, but almost certainly to a lesser extent than the period of the pre-collapse pharaohs. This is one of the reasons scholars believe the Exodus narrative, as such, doesn't make a whole lot of sense as a late Bronze Age story and fits in much better with the Iron Age. Before the collapse, Egypt controlled the Levant, and they did so fairly directly, with military garrisons up the coast and based strongly out of Gaza. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the Israelites to run from the Egyptians into the land of, well, the Egyptians. Now, though, they ruled at a distance, extracting some wealth, but after Shawshank rarely making military incursions, or worse for their supposed subjects, offering much military support when other empires decided to make a go at the Levant. They were less extractive, sure, but they were also less helpful. We're still not quite at the point of finding much of contemporary historical value in the Bible outside of perhaps some names and approximate dates of kings' reigns. Most of these narratives about the kings follow their deaths with a line like, "As for everything else about Abiyam, isn't it all written down in the books of the Acts of the Kings of Israel or the books of the Acts of the Kings of Judah?" Showing that our current book used previous sources that have been edited and themselves lost to the sands of time. How those books were formatted, whether they were merely kings' lists with a few notes attached to each name, it's all uncertain. So while we still have to be cautious and recognize that many of the details have been edited and redacted and were themselves written down after these events took place, there's plenty to explore in the text as we've received it. For example, when Solomon's legendary but probably fictional son King Rehoboam dies, Rehoboam's own son Abiyam or Abiyah takes over. But Abiyam's reign is cut short to just 3 years. He's killed in the civil war between Judah and Israel that stretches on past the deaths of Solomon and Rehoboam. With Abiyam's death, the throne is said to pass to his son Asa, who rules for a staggering 41 years. But the story of his reign is interspersed with discussions of either his stepmother or grandmother Maacah, one of Rehoboam's or Solomon's wives. It's unclear in the text to whom she was married. See, if Asa was a king of Judah, which isn't a given, he seems to be implied in the narrative to be a child when he ascends to the throne, and Maacah appears to act as queen mother, the effective steward of the kingdom in the absence of a monarch, like Denethor in Lord of the Rings.
Rule of Gondor is mine, and no others.
We discussed briefly the way Hatshepsut of Egypt acted as king in a similar circumstance, where her husband died out, but there was no boy of age eligible for the throne. And in the Second Temple period, we will get our first true queen of Judea under comparable conditions. Of course, you'd also be familiar with this if you've read something like A Song of Ice and Fire or seen Game of Thrones, where Cersei assumes the role of queen regent after the death of one of her sons, and while her younger son isn't quite old enough. According to past Bible lore guest Susan Ackerman, the role of queen mother, known in Hebrew as Gebirah, sorry for the pronunciation, could be in part to influence the selection of the next king, the order of succession. Solomon's mother acts as what Ackerman calls the paradigmatic exemplar of the Gebirim in advocating for her own son's ascension to the throne over David's other older sons. In Maacah's case, she retains her role as Gebirah and her influence despite her own son dying and Asa taking the throne. Now, whether she was a real queen or not, she's blamed in the text for bringing the worship of Ashera into the Judahite cult, presumably setting up a wooden Ashera statue or pole in the Jerusalem temple. This is considered one of the original sins of Judah, something that will prefigure its eventual downfall nearly 300 years later. Most likely, however, whenever Yahweh showed up on the scene and merged with El, him taking on Ashera, traditionally El's wife, would have been an essential part of gaining widespread acceptance in stressing that he was El. What I'm saying is that despite the Bible's protesting to the contrary, Ashera was not some foreign plant. She was likely there from day one. Despite being eventually, centuries later, cast aside and pointed to as an example of good cult gone bad, with the people being called Israel, it is almost certain that she was worshipped among the people before Yahweh ever was. And again, critical in Yahweh's journey to the top. You don't get to be El of the pantheon if you're single. It's like a swingers club, no single guys. And if you're El or Ea, you'd have a consort like Atharat or Astarte or Ishtar or Asherah. What's more, the Queen Mother's ties to Asherah could be, depending on their kingdom's cult, an important part of their cultic authority. In this earlier era, where the royal cult and the royal throne usually weren't separate institutions, this would have been essential. Part of the way Queen Mothers, Gebirim, in the south seem to have authorized their influence is through their connection with Asherah, particularly in cases where the king is dead. They get the ability to choose the next king from among the royal sons based on their cultic authority through Asherah. This absence of patriarchal power in Maacah's case seems to have opened up a place for her to become a competing and rather assertive royal figure in a way that was typically not given to women. and Ashera seems to have played a role in that in the minds of these much later Judahite authors. Even in the time of the authors of the Book of Kings, centuries after the life of Maacah, if she existed, when Ashera worship had recently been banned, there was still living memory of a time where the queen and Ashera had gone hand in hand, exerting their command over politics and cult. But for her crimes, Maacah is removed from power by King Asa, and the Ashera poles are supposedly cut down. Curiously, however, in our earliest prophetic writings, there's not a word spoken against Ashera worship. There are condemnations of worshipping Baal in Hosea, a prophetic work that probably has roots in the 8th century, but nothing against Ashera among the prophets until we get to the 6th century's Jeremiah, who is probably referencing her when discussing the Queen of Heaven, an ancient title given to supreme sky goddesses like Anat, Astarte, and Isis. But that's not until the early 500s, centuries from where we find ourselves today, and it's from after Josiah's reforms, where Yahweh and Ashera were forcibly divorced by what seems to have been a small group of fundamentalist Yahwists. In fact, there are no condemnations of the worship of God's wife that can be securely dated prior to the time of Josiah at all. Even more wild, so many inscriptions we have from the period have Ashera included as a critical component of who Yahweh was. In the modern West Bank at Khirbet el-Kham, archaeologists a few decades ago discovered some ancient inscriptions dating to the 8th century BCE. One of those bits reads something like this: "Blessed is Uriyahu by Yahweh. Yea, from his adversaries by his Ashera he has saved him." Now, we've got some serious pronoun confusion there, but it's clear that whatever this blessing is, it's directed at someone named Uriah or Uriyahu, which means something like flame of Yahweh, pronounced here Yahu. And the author writes that through Yahweh's Ashera, Uriyahu has been saved. At least that's the closest reconstruction. And it's not the only inscription of its kind. Similar to the El-Kham inscription, an even older inscription was found at a site called Kuntalet Ajrud, on the Egyptian side of the border of the Sinai Peninsula. It was discovered during the Israeli occupation of the Sinai in the 1970s, an often misunderstood and complex event that we can't get into here, except to acknowledge that unfortunately none of what we talk about on this show is truly separate from the colonial ambitions of the modern nation-state of Israel and the horrible wars and persecutions of the 20th and 21st centuries. One particular archaeological find unearthed at Kuntalet Ajrud attests to the imperial structures of its own day, sometime around the end of the 9th century, when the site seems to have been some kind of rest area on the trek through the desert. One piece of pottery found at Kuntalet Ajrud contains an inscription that is itself a testament to the imperial structures of its day. It contains a few Bes-like figures. Bes was primarily an Egyptian protective god, often placed around entryways to keep out evil spirits or demons. Bes came from southern Egypt, possibly from as far south as the Horn of Africa, and came to Egypt sometime in the 2nd millennium, spreading as far as Syria. These little protective guys and gals would remain popular well into the Roman period. On our piece of pottery, a few different hands scratched in drawings and writings, a cow with her calf feeding, some vague inscriptions that seem to refer to an Israelite, and 3 Bes figures, one sitting down in a cuck chair, watching a male and female pair in front of him. The male of the couple is even hanging dong. While Yahweh and Ashera are not really associated with Bes by most accounts, someone else seems to have come in later and written a blessing over the top of these 2 figures, blessing all, quote, by Yahweh of Samaria and his Ashera. Whether linking Yahweh and his Ashera with the Bes figures was an invention of the writer or something more widespread is probably impossible to know. But as we have it, it's one of a very few bodily depictions of the God of the Bible that's been found from this period. So Yahweh is often associated with his Ashera, which seems to be not only a reference to the goddess herself, as in the Kuntalet Ajrud inscription, but often specifically her tree-like physical manifestation as a budding rod. It's a budding branch. In some ways, her and Yahweh were viewed as an inseparable pair, with her symbol always at his side. Some more fundamentalist Christians I knew growing up claimed that Ashera poles were even associated with Christmas trees. Now, sadly, there are absolutely no ties between Ashera poles and Christmas trees, so please don't tear down your Tenenbaums. But Ashera's association with trees is fascinating. She's often portrayed as a budding branch with multiple branches coming out of it, and when we imagine Yahweh holding his Ashera at his side, it may have sometimes been imagined as being this budding branch. In episode 9, I talked about the origins of the Levites as portrayed in Exodus, with a murderous slaughtering of all those who created a golden calf, given as a story for how they earned their place. Another part of the authorization of the Levites as a priestly class in the Torah, perhaps a competing tradition, is found in Numbers 17. In the previous chapter, the Israelites piss Yahweh off multiple times, leading him to kill thousands of them. Hundreds of them through opening the ground up and swallowing them directly into Sheol, shooting his beam of fire out and killing 250 of them, and inflicting a whole lot more of them with a plague which kills over 14,000. In the aftermath, Yahweh has Moses collect a staff from the leader of each tribe, and the staff which sprouts will be Yahweh's priestly class, the authorized cultic professionals. Aaron's staff sprouts, and therefore the Levites are chosen, and they go on to build the meeting tent and the tabernacle, Yahweh's sacred dwelling place that we discussed in episode 9. If the sacred object of Aaron's staff did indeed exist or was held in the Jerusalem temple or in Shechem or Bethel, it would have looked strikingly like an Ashera pole, a budding branch. Later, one of the reforming kings, Josiah's great-grandfather Hezekiah, is said to have destroyed many of the Asherim, and even one of the other sacred objects of Moses and Aaron, a bronze snake that we'll get into in a later episode. With most scholars agreeing that this story dates from Josiah's time, it seems likely that whoever wrote the approving story of Aaron's Asherah rod did so either before this Inquisition or perhaps in some subversive way that maintains a tension between competing authors or competing factions of Yahwists who can't agree on whether Asherim represent proper cult or not. Both stories of the Levites' origins, however, made it into the Torah as we have it, and so we get that tension. While it's possible that many Asherim were torn down by cultic reformers, unfortunately as objects made of wood, their chances of surviving to us today are incredibly slim. We do, however, have a couple of archaeological finds that can help demonstrate what Asherim might have looked like. The first is not a tree itself, but a figure of a woman with twins at her breasts, exposing her vulva with her hands as she nurses her children.
Oh, that's terrific. Vulva.
Perhaps dawn and dusk, as portrayed in The Lovely Gods, which we went over in episode 8. On each leg, there's an ibex snacking on a branch. This figurine dates to around the 13th century, so it's a bit before our time, but something right in our timeline. And one of the coolest archaeological discoveries of all time is the discovery of 2 terracotta cult stands found in Tianik in the Palestinian West Bank, though whoever wrote the Wikipedia article for the Tianak cult stand slyly tries to shift that over the border to the nearby Israeli-controlled Megiddo, which is just whatever. I still love Wikipedia, even if it constantly annoys me. Anyway, what's usually called the Tianak cult stand, coming from somewhere around the 10th century, when Jeroboam would have reigned, measures about 53 centimeters or 21 inches tall, almost 2 feet. And I'm going to have a version of it as the artwork for this episode so that you can check it out. Both stands are shaped as a sort of vertical rectangle that's segmented by horizontal lines, and they have windows on each side that perhaps suggest something like a statue was contained inside. It's got a little window so that you can look in at the cultic object. In fact, each vertical segment has different animals and chimeras on it. We may have a description of similar kinds of stands being attributed to Solomon in 1 Kings 7. Quote, "He also made the 10 stands of bronze. Each stand was 4 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, and 3 cubits high. This was the construction of the stands. They had borders. The borders were within the frames. On the borders that were set in the frames were lions, oxen, and cherubim. On the frames, both above and below the lions and oxen, there were wreaths of beveled work. And indeed, on the main Tianak cult stand, there does appear to be lions, maybe bulls, and definitely cherubim, mishvazen, on the stands with spiraled bordering and wreath motifs. It's very similar, even though they're made out of terracotta rather than bronze. However, one thing not mentioned in King's description is something found on both of these stands. Budding branches with twin ibexes eating the leaves, just like the other Ashera figurine, a classic motif of the goddess that gives us a good idea of what her imagery looked like. And on the main cult stand, below the ibexes, there's even an image of the goddess herself, with prominent breasts and an exposed vulva, just like the 13th century Ugarit figurine.
Mulva?
Mulva?
Even more tantalizing is the suggestion by some scholars that this image of Ashera as a tree with budding branches stemming off of it lives on until today in the Jewish menorah. While the Star of David is a much more famous symbol for Jews and Judaism, its appearance begins in late antiquity, deep into Roman history. It's practically modern compared to the menorah, which is described in detail in the Torah itself. According to the Torah, the menorah is to be set inside of the temple, though not in the innermost sanctum, serving as both light and as a divine symbol, one made to recall both Yahweh's fire and a life-giving tree. Scholar Benjamin Sommer notes that this could be a vestige of Asherah's place in the temple, a symbol of her elevated place next to Yahweh's very living quarters. If true, it has remained as a blind motif for over 2,000 years, stretching down to us today. But who was this goddess who cast such a long shadow over the history of the Bible? Oftentimes, Ashera is described as a fertility goddess, but scholar Francesca Stavrakopoulou urges us to look a bit beyond this sort of every female god is a fertility god cliche. See, as I've discussed a bit in a past episode, fertility was often thought of as the male's responsibility. Gods like Yahweh and Enki had their seed, while women had the soil. This meant that much of the time, infertility was blamed on the woman. Must be barren soil for the seed not to find purchase. We see this in biblical stories of folks like Abraham and his wife Sarah. It's never Abraham who's the problem, notably. It's Sarah's womb that's said to be barren and which requires Yahweh's intervention. Abraham is the chief patriarch who fathers Isaac, who then begat Jacob, later named Israel. Abraham is often portrayed as sort of the prismatic focal point that all nations flow out of. And indeed, many of the Israelites and Judahites' neighbors are given etiological origin stories, including famously Ishmael.
You can call me Ishmael.
Isaac's half-brother, who's portrayed as the father of a people located somewhere in the Sinai Peninsula or the Northwest Arabian Peninsula. But there's an even more expansive and detailed explanation of where all the peoples of the earth came from, all 70 of them, in Genesis 10. You'll usually see it referred to as the Table of Nations, but I am so goddamn stubborn about not using the word nation in this podcast that I'm calling it the Table of Peoples, and that's that. Don't email me about it. So in Genesis 10, the 70 peoples are portrayed as the descendants of Noah's 3 sons after the global flood, and they're described in detail, from west to east, from Spain to Iran, or perhaps even Afghanistan and Pakistan, and north to south from Ukraine to Yemen and the Horn of East Africa. That, in essence, was the whole known world from the West Asian perspective, and it was made up of a perfect number of 70 peoples. As scholar Jonathan Day notes, the fact that India is not mentioned means that this particular version of the list of 70 peoples likely comes from before the book of Esther was written, sometime in the 4th century. So at the very least, we have that dating somewhat secure. But the figure of 70 peoples predates that by quite a bit, though obviously the particular peoples worth noting would shift as political structures themselves shifted. To find an earlier mention of these 70 peoples, we once again return to our old friends at Ugarit. Remember the Baal cycle, where Baal wants to build a house, so he asks Atharat, aka Ashera, to talk to El and ask for permission to start construction? That Baal cycle? Well, after having his house built, Baal asks all of Asherah's children over for a party, all 70 of them. Presumably each one a patron god for each people of the world. And despite Ashera being condemned and erased by later scribes, we still get this divine council of the gods of the world mentioned frequently throughout the biblical texts, all of Asherah's children. So Ashera was the wet nurse and mother to the gods. She helped authorize real-world politics for queens like Maacah, and among her other epithets in the Baal cycle, she's called the lady who tramples the sea serpent, which ties her in some way to our chaos-taming motif that hangs so heavily over the Bible's mythology. She was there with Baal, conquering the mighty sea Yam and perhaps the Leviathan Leton. But Stavrakopoulou also notes that we may have one positive mention of Ashera that slipped past the censor's eye. Deuteronomy 33 has some redactions, but it's broadly agreed to contain some rather old poetry, where Moses relates Yahweh's blessings to each tribe of Israel. We talked about it in episode 7. In the preamble, however, there's a word that is one of the more difficult in the Bible to translate. Some even consider it a likely lost word. The NRSV puts it this way: Yahweh came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran. With him were myriads of holy ones. At his right a host of his own. And it's that last line that is tricky. Any version of the Bible will have a footnote that essentially tells you they don't really have a clue. Some translations say he has a fiery law at his right hand, especially older translations, which doesn't make much sense. Others, like Robert Alter, go with the divine warrior motif and say he's shooting firebolts from his hand, which is possible. It's also possible that the word being translated, Eshdot, means his Ashera is at his right hand. If so, it would represent perhaps the only place where the goddess isn't treated as an aberration, an accident of history where even folks 2,300 years ago couldn't quite make out what the ancient word meant. Though, again, it's not certain. Like a lot of this old poetry, it's rather difficult and argued over endlessly, which is why new translations come out every few years as scholars make progress and inch us ever so closely toward the ancients. Perhaps one day Ashera will get her due, restored to her rightful place at Yahweh's side. We'll get into Yahweh's origins next episode because he's finally here. He's finally getting his day in the sun. But for now, we can note that it's extremely clear that he quickly inherited Ashera from El. So all we need to take this discussion of Maacah polluting the pure Judahite cult with her nasty foreign Ashera as a later retconning of what seems to have been a completely banal reality of God having a wife, we can discuss our first big interdeity beef, the first of many gods Yahwist would consider evil and an important negative identity marker. It's Baal versus Yahweh. Baal, for those who've forgotten, was the regional storm god from whom Yahweh inherited a fair bit of lore, like the battle with Leviathan we discussed earlier in this episode, but who was so close in function and form that it eventually became an important ethnic and political identity boundary between the Judahites, the Israelites, and their neighbors. Basically, they were cousins who butted heads. In fact, Baal, which was also a word for Lord, was often used in the early period to refer to the head of the Israelite and Judahite pantheon, hence one of Saul's sons being named Eshbaal, later redacted to Ishbosheth, meaning man of shame. But despite chronologically earlier stories of the Israelites being seduced by the Canaanite god of thunder, Baal's shameful place of prominence in the Israelite cult is placed mostly at the feet of one queen, Jezebel. To get to her, we need to fast forward through a couple of decades in the narrative of the Book of Kings, which is helpful since the Bible does that too. So after Jeroboam's death, his son Nadab takes over, followed by a succession of a few kings. The same thing happens with Asa, Rehoboam's son, in the south, and the whole thing reads like a yada yada, progressing the story quickly past the early establishment and destruction of the United Monarchy, quickly marching us through a bunch of disputes into the 9th century where our sources likely started to have more detail. But the Deuteronomistic history sources seem to have been missing quite a bit or left a lot of details out, as one of the kings yada yada'd is the very one whose monumental works archaeologists believe were attributed to Solomon by the later authors of the Bible, Omri. In the middle of brief descriptions of an internal civil war within Israel among those vying to be Nadab's successor, Omri seizes power. Based on archaeology and the fact that the dynasty was later called the House of Omri, he seems to have been the one who built many of the early northern monumental works, like those found at Megiddo and Hatzor. or at least he conscripted the labor to build these little fortified cities. And Omri did something else that's had a lasting impression, one that we don't even have to look in the dirt to see. He moved the capital of Israel, whatever the kingdom or chiefdom looked like at the time, from Tirzah to a city whose name you might be familiar with. From Tirzah or Shechem to a city whose name you might be familiar with from earlier this episode and from, well, current culture, Samaria. To this day, there are around 1,000 Samaritans left in Israel and Palestine. They are not Jews, they are northerners from the historical land of Samaria, and each year they celebrate Passover and other similar festivals and rituals to their Jewish neighbors. They are the last to make annual animal sacrifices for their version of Passover at their own shrine on Mount Geritzim, atop a ruined temple which lies just a few miles southeast of the village of Sebastia, Samaria's modern name. At some point in the first half of the first millennium BCE, something resembling the first ever Passover at the shrine near Samaria began a chain that reaches down to us today, a remarkable legacy. And despite some polemics to the contrary within the Bible, ones that claim that when the north was destroyed, all its inhabitants were driven out, that claim everyone living there afterwards was a foreigner, it is extremely likely that there is something of a fairly direct line going all the way back from modern Samaritans through the famous Good Samaritan parable of the New Testament to our historical Samaria referenced as housing Yahweh of Samaria and his Ashera in the Kuntalet Ajrud inscription, all the way back to Omri, some 2,900 years ago. Of course, Omri's Samaria and its royal cult with a married divine couple would have looked quite different to later iterations, and despite his apparent achievements at uniting the land of Israel and building its first fortified cities, he gets pretty short shrift in the account in Kings, with the 13 verses of his story being mostly concerned with his overthrow of King Zimri and his war of unification over the rest of Israel, ending the dispute. Just 13 verses, and yet when empires in the future talk about Israel, they call it the House of Omri, just like the South is called the House of David. If I still haven't convinced you that the Deuteronomistic history is missing some serious details and is a particularly Southern bias, I hope that this neglect of Omri helps resolve the matter. It's no wonder that the Samaritans, both in antiquity and now, do not accept anything but their own version of the Torah as sacred scripture. Their own history is often treated rather poorly by the authors of the rest of the Bible. Perhaps some of these kings deserve the ire of these writers, but it would be hard to argue that they were much different from the southern kings who met a similar fate, but are often treated with a gentler touch. All that said, moving the capital to Samaria was a key part of finally making Omri's monarchy a force to be reckoned with. It's a town that was situated along major trade routes, distinguishing it from the hilly regions of Tirzah and Shechem, the previous out-of-the-way northern strongholds of the smaller dynasties that preceded Omri, whatever they looked like. For better and eventually for worse, Samaria became the kind of capital city that draws the attention of the bigger regional players. But if Omri gets little mention in the Bible, whether through reading the Book of Kings or just cultural osmosis, you're more likely to be familiar with his son, Ahab.
Captain Ahab, I am game for any kind of death if it comes in the way of the business we follow. That they know. But I came here to hunt whales, not my commander's vengeance.
And it's his marriage to Jezebel that we'll turn to now. She's said to hail from Sidon, a kingdom on the Phoenician coast in Lebanon. So to tell her story, let's talk about what international politics has been like since Shawshank's incursion from Egypt. The Assyrians were poised to expand, but hadn't quite consolidated enough control to spread too far northwest for the time being. This kept the Neo-Hittites, a somewhat short-lived kingdom, as a bit of a buffer between Assyria and Aram, a kingdom that gave us the long-standing Aramaic language, which is still spoken by some groups in the Middle East today, including by Mizrahi Jews in the state of Israel, in Kurdish lands, and elsewhere. Aram bordered Omri's kingdom on the northeast, based out of Damascus in modern-day Syria, which remains one of the longest occupied human settlements that still functions as a city to this day. And Damascus shares that honor with Tyre, another still extant city on Lebanon's Mediterranean coast, in what was then known as Phoenicia. Phoenicia rose to prominence in the vacuum of imperial control after the Bronze Age collapse. It was a series of fairly prominent port cities. While Ugarit was destroyed, other cities flourished on the coast, and without the military might to claim control, Vandermeer notes that the Egyptians had to instead strike a far less lucrative commercial trade agreement with Tyre and the rest of the Phoenician cities, allowing them not only autonomy, but the ability to build up their own political and military might. Without the extractive empire, they were the ones who retained most of the profit from their own trade. And all of these smaller kingdoms would exist as a hotbed between the resurgent Egyptians and Assyrians. As we go through this history, the little old Moabites, Philistines, Ammonites, Edomites, Phoenicians, Judahites, and Israelites of the Levant will unite with each other and fight against each other in a vice grip of imperial reassertion between the Assyrians and the Egyptians. For now, with the ascendance of the Israelite kingdom, despite some vassalage of his own to the distant Egyptians, King Omri strengthened his position and explored some options by forming an alliance with the king of Tyre. The biblical authors like to call the kingdom of Tyre Sidon instead, after another one of the influential Phoenician cities, so don't be shocked when you look in the good book and see a different name. But Ethbaal, Jezebel's father, ruled from Tyre. Jezebel's name is itself a telling connection between the Baal cycle and the Bible. When Baal is swallowed by death in the story, her name seems to be the cry of the people, starving without his crop-growing rain. Where is the prince? Where is the Lord? Where is Baal? Jezebel, to an even greater degree than Maacah before her, and with a viciousness rarely ascribed to Ashera, would be depicted by the biblical authors as a wicked foreign queen, everything wrong that polluted the Israelites and led to their destruction a century later, and she would receive a violent end, fitting for someone who is so hated. While Ashera was perhaps an embarrassing footnote, condemned far later, Baal was viewed by the end of the 8th century as a symbol of outsider influence, the god of the peoples who ruled over Israel before its destruction, and later biblical authors would put the majority of the blame on her. She's a foreigner. Her name has Baal in it. She comes from a wealthy city that offers no help in Israel's time of need. And along with other figures like Delilah, her legacy has survived as a symbol of everything alien and wicked that supposedly contaminates purity. The author of Revelation would cast a fellow Christ-following preacher who he disagreed with as a new Jezebel, using incredibly violent and sexually charged language and accusations, saying, quote, "I gave her time to repent, but she refuses to repent of her sexual immorality. Beware, I am throwing her on a bed, and those who commit adultery with her I am throwing into great distress, unless they repent of her doings, and I will strike her children dead." Yikes! And it's all over pop culture today. Even the great Lauryn Hill gets in on the Jezebel hate.
And now that was the sin that did Jezebel in.
But there's a particularly unique psalm that celebrates the marriage of a foreigner to the king, a song of hope that the allegiance of two houses will strengthen them politically, and hint that Jezebel's portrayal as a corrupting foreigner might be a tad unfair, like Queen Mother Maacah before her, whose veneration of Ashera would not have been at all forbidden, or even out of the ordinary at the time. In fact, it would have been expected of her as a good and upstanding queen. This is perhaps the episode with the strongest connections yet to real history, to contemporary culture surrounding Israel and Judah, and its history that stretches down even to our time. The capital at Samaria, mentions of Yahweh and his Ashera, Omri as the first king confidently found outside of the Bible, Hebrew as a distinct written language, the Pharaoh Shishak, it all points to the very beginnings of what would eventually become the Bible in the 9th century. The Bible is in many ways a product of the end of these kingdoms, of the exile and the return under the Persians, but the Iron Age shines through just a bit. The first major king, Omri, isn't named specifically in our contemporary inscriptions, only as the House of Omri. Instead, it's his son Ahab, who we find directly referenced twice across West Asia. And it's to King Ahab, Queen Jezebel, their struggle to keep their kingdom together, and the origins of their beloved God Yahweh that we turn to on the next episode of the Bible Lore Podcast. Remember to support the show by subscribing at patreon.com/Bible Lore Podcast. It's just $5 per month.